we actually find that changing employment is often a really good trigger for reviewing your super, and so it's probably worthwhile just spending a little bit of time talking about super and investments. And there's a few things that we would typically suggest that you review. Firstly, the type of super fund that you're in, what sort of investment option you've selected within your super fund. Thirdly, I guess, the types of super contributions that you can make and I guess whether you can and should be making them. And then I guess the pros and cons of making those super contributions. So we might just spend a little bit of time just talking about each of those in a bit of detail.
So each type of super fund has its pros and its cons. To give you an example, an industry fund is relatively low cost and cheap, which is good, but on the downside, it's quite limited in terms of the investment options and very low touch, low service.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of bells and whistles with industry super funds, do you?
Exactly, it's very basic.
Yeah.
Conversely, there's retail funds and self-managed super funds, which give you access to a lot wider range of investment options, so you can manage it in a more professional manner. But with that comes a higher expense. So whether that makes sense or not really depends on your needs again. And then the other type, which is quite important to understand, is corporate super funds. So depending on your employer that you're coming from, they may have had an employer super plan. And what that means is they subsidise a lot of the costs associated with the plan. So that could be the ongoing administration fees or the insurance premiums. So as part of moving out of that employer, you may actually move from what they call the corporate division to the personal division. And with that can mean a change in your fees, so they can be higher, and also the insurance premiums can go up. So it's important to really understand these.
Okay, so no matter what type of super fund you've got, how it's invested is probably one of the most important things that we think you should be thinking about with your super. And firstly, I should point out that superannuation isn't an asset itself, like property or shares or bonds or whatever. I mean, you've got absolute choice as to where you invest your super, and you can be as conservative, or as aggressive as you want to be with your super. So I guess one thing that we do recommend for most people is it's important to have a bit of an in-depth look as to where you are invested and how much risk that you're taking on, and importantly, don't just accept the default option that comes with most super funds, because it might actually be appropriate for you.
Yeah, because what we find, one of the misconceptions is when people are comparing super funds, so super fund A with super fund B, they're looking at the performance numbers, but not necessarily understanding what risk each fund is taking. So it's quite important to understand the different levels of growth and defensive assets. So what growth assets are, think of assets like shares, property, infrastructure, so more volatile, but in saying that, they're expected to generate a higher return over the long term. Conversely, defensive assets are things like cash and bonds, more stable, so not as much volatility, but the returns are expected to be lower, and especially in the current environment, with interest rates so low, it's quite difficult to generate a return there. But the purpose is to really protect that side of the portfolio.
Yeah, so getting that mix of investments, or what we call the asset allocation, right, it's really dependent upon a few things like your age, how long you've got till your retirement, and just your personal risk profile. And look, there's no one size fits all answer to that really, but look, it's vitally important that you do review that and make sure you have the right investment option. Because I guess a person who's in their 20s or 30s, who's not retiring for another 20 or 30 years, they can afford to be a little more risky, a little more aggressive with their investments than someone who's just about to retire.
Yeah, exactly. So if we can encourage you to do anything, it'd be, one, go have a look at how your super's invested, just to get an understanding how much risk you're actually taking. In addition to reviewing your super fund and the investment options, it's also a good time to consider whether it's appropriate to make additional super contributions, so above and beyond the 9.5% that your employer makes. So some of the advantages of making those contributions is that you can potentially reduce the amount of income tax that you're paying along the way. But the main advantage is, for the long term, you're moving money into what's called the concessionally taxed superannuation environment, where whilst you're working, it's taxed at up to 15%. And then once you retire, the earnings become tax-free, the income becomes tax-free. So it's quite an attractive option there.
Absolutely. So there's obviously huge advantages for putting money into super, but there are some disadvantages as well, which is probably worth running through. Firstly, there are contribution limits that apply. So if you are thinking about putting extra money into super, it's important to be aware that what those limits are and making sure that you don't exceed them. And again, if you are putting money into super, I guess the one disadvantage is that you're not going to have access to that money immediately. So you're really, I guess, putting money away for for use in the future. But probably the biggest disadvantage with making extra super contributions for most people is that they can't actually access that money out of super until they meet what's called a condition of release, which for most people is not until they retire after the age of 60. So if you are thinking of putting extra money into super, you kind of need to be pretty comfortable that you're not going to be able to touch that money for possibly many years.
And one of the things that we find too is, whilst they can be a downside, it can also be a positive. So for those people that sort of want to have that money quarantined so they're not tempted to dip into it, it's a good way of keeping that separate and compounding and generating some interest along the way.
That's a good point.